Right. Finding relevant imagery is going to be tricky on this one. Dungeons & Dragons on Among Thieves. I saw it yesterday, but I just really want to talk about jumping through portals, or dimensional doors, I guess? It's the magic system I want to focus on. But if you want a review, I saw it. I liked it. You might too if you like Guardians of the Galaxy Marvel-style humor in fantasy. There will likely be spoilers, so if that matters to you, pause, watch it, come back, but otherwise, stay a while and listen. In Dungeons & Dragons, there's a running joke with the character Hulga the Barbarian, where wherever she runs into a problem that seems magical in nature, she says, well, let's just fix the problem with magic. To which Simon the Sorcerer says, I hate when people keep saying that. You can't just solve things with magic. There are limits. Now, these are character jokes that work within this story. For Hulga, she knows nothing of magic, so it makes sense to her to just solve the magic using the magic thing. And Simon, who knows a great deal about magic, and is well aware of the limits of magic because he can't do it himself, is the one to counter her. However, this is also a philosophy of how magic is used within their story. There are limits. And furthermore, this goes to a wider conversation when we talk about fantasy. When fantasy stories are critiqued, inevitably the defense is raised, well, it's fiction, it's fantasy, magic made it happen. And it depends. Very often a reason to get into fantasy is to experience something fantastical. And although my preferred style of fantasy tends to read a little more like historical fiction, I would argue Lord of the Rings, there's lots of space for the bizarre and the whimsical within fantasy. And if you're looking at floating islands and asking yourself, well, how does it work? Magic is a perfectly acceptable answer. Or what are the mechanics of a druid turning into a animal, bear, owlbear, a deer, so on and so forth? Magic is a perfectly acceptable answer to that. And the idea like, well, that doesn't happen in real life. It's like, yeah, we're watching fantasy. We want to see something that's kind of strange and bizarre. But not everything goes. Pointing back to Tolkien, he's pushing against the idea of willing suspension of disbelief. That's inaccurate of what we're actually doing when we get into these stories. That state of mind has been called willing suspension of disbelief, but this does not seem to me a good description of what happens. What really happens is that the storyteller proves a successful sub-creator. He makes a secondary world which your mind can enter. Inside it, what he relates is true. It accords with the laws of that world. You therefore believe it while you are, as it were, inside. How does this work practically? Any fantasy world begins with a blank canvas. And before the story begins, in that sense, anything can happen. However, unless otherwise stated, we're probably going to assume that things are operating according to how we understand the world to work. So for instance, you present me with horses in a fantasy world, I'm probably going to expect horses to work in the same way they do in real life. To the best of my knowledge, I'm not a horse person. But if you give me some horses that do not tire, and then say, these are special horses, I'll say, fair enough. They're horses of the gods. They don't tire so easily. We've now introduced a rule. I don't need to know the biology behind it. That's probably good enough. Or in this universe, horses fly now. We've now introduced another rule. We are narrowing what can and cannot happen. And in this case, if our heroes are riding a horse, flying is an option to get themselves out of trouble. If, however, the hero arrives at a tremendous gap that they must cross, and suddenly the horses cannot fly, anything can happen. Its fantasy will not suffice. The writer introduced the rule that horses can fly now, where in a situation where horses can fly, if the writer wants to prevent the horses from flying, they must provide some sort of explanation, or acknowledge that there is a problem with their capability of flying and provide an explanation later. So anything can happen until rules are put in place on how this fantastical world works, and then that begins to narrow what can or cannot happen. And the more the story starts violating the rules that the writer themselves put into place, disbelief begins to arise. And Tolkien writes, the moment disbelief arises, the spell is broken. The magic, or rather art, has failed. You are then out in the primary world again, looking at the little abortive secondary world from the outside. If you are obliged by the kindliness or circumstances to stay, then disbelief must be suspended or stifled, otherwise listing and looking would become intolerable. But this suspension of disbelief is a substitute that has, for us, failed. And so then it will even depend on what sort of fantasy world we're in. Towards the end of Dungeons & Dragons, there's that giant maze that raises and lowers. If this was Lord of the Rings, I would want to know what sort of machines causes this, who in the world made this, because it's so out of keeping with everything else in the Lord of the Rings, and Tolkien bothers to provide that sort of detail. But this movie is a lot more wild. it's a bit more batty. It's got man-eating chests and giant gelatin cubes, and so magic, or a wizard did it, is a perfectly good explanation. But even in a film that's a bit more batty, just because anything could happen doesn't mean anything should. If at the end of Dungeons & Dragons, the villain defeated the heroes, but then, at the last moment, Doc Brown appears with his DeLorean and says, "We have to go back!" And then they time travel to an earlier part of the story and defeat the villain there, I hope you would call foul, because the film did not establish that this was a multiverse where Back to the Future was part of it, nor did it establish that time travel was a thing. Or backing up a bit, suppose again the villain won, but then at the last minute the heroes summon a fleet of Death Stars and defeat the villain. Again, it's magic. Anything can happen. I hope that's not what we would say. There are implied limits, and the longer the story goes, the more we should have a sense of what can and cannot happen. Its fiction is not a sufficient excuse. It can happen, but it shouldn't happen. But this is what makes the Dungeons & Dragons film so great. When they discover they can create portals to teleport from one location to another, it also comes with some serious limitations. Simon the Sorcerer figures it can only be used to portal about 500 yards or so. You also need line of sight. You need to see the destination and where you are launching from. You can't simply imagine any location and teleport there. You need to be able to see where you're going to end up. And this is almost like directly from Brandon Sanderson's playbook, his 3 laws of magic. Now, they're more like guidelines than actual rules. But here's the first one. An author's ability to solve conflict with magic is directly proportional to how well the reader understands said magic. So going back to that maze, the maze is not used to solve any problems. It is trouble itself. We actually don't need to know that much about it. This is where a lot of mysterious magic comes in. Lord of the Rings. The magic in Lord of the Rings is mostly trouble. We don't need to know that much about it. By contrast, the heroes of Dungeons & Dragons being able to make portals to teleport from one location to another is most definitely something that can be used to solve problems. We need to know much more on how that works. And it goes straight into Brandon Sanderson's second law. Limitations are greater than powers. In other words, what's most interesting about a magical ability is not the power itself, but how it is limited. The heroes recognize the portal magic as being incredibly useful and would like to use it to teleport directly into the villain's treasury. However, they cannot because they do not have line of sight on the other end. This limitation forces creativity. Instead, they concoct a plan to make one end of the portal hidden in a painting that can then be moved and placed into the treasury. This leads to a heist where they use their portal magic to break into an armored carriage that is bringing treasure that will end up in the treasury. They plant this painting within the carriage and exit out. The armored carriage continues on its way, gets into the capital, drops off its treasure at the treasury, including the painting with the hidden portal exit. You would not get any of that if you could just teleport directly into the treasury. So we need to know the limits of the abilities, and we need to know the abilities in advance. Now, technically, the first time the portals are used, we did not have advance warning. Holga the Barbarian picks up a stick when she leaves her ex's house, but there's no hint that there's anything magical about it. They're trying to cross a very large gap, but the bridge breaks. Oh no, how are we going to solve this problem? Oh hey, you happen to have a walking stick that also creates portals to get across. So there's not a lot of foreshadowing for this portal magic, but I don't mind it being revealed in this way. Now, if this was the final battle, and this is the very first time this ability has appeared, even mentioned, I would call foul. It's not actually critical that they used portal magic to get across the bridge. They were under no time pressure, and given enough, they could have probably come up with something else. There was mention of rope. Maybe that would work. I don't know. The point is, the first time it's used and just pulled out of a bag, ta-da, I have something that would conveniently solve our problems. It is a sort of plot contrivance, but it's not critical. It's an acceptable one. And really, this is a very D&D adventurer party to somehow have accumulated a strange collection of items of dubious origin, of questionable utility. The key thing is, once the heroes know they have this tool in their tool belt, they immediately start trying to find application to solve their problems. First, they teleport across the gap. Second, they use it to escape the dragon at one point, to jump from one level to another. And this is good. This actually goes to Sanderson's third law. Expand what you already have before you add something new. They already have a staff that teleports them into locations. The next time they need to teleport across somewhere, rather than creating a new teleporting power, they're getting value out of the teleporting power they already have. And finding new applications for old abilities allows the characters to demonstrate their cleverness. So they use the portal magic to cross the bridge, they used it to escape the dragon. The next time they use it is when they're trying to plant the picture into the armored carrier. So they use the portal to get inside. Then, of course, they have the portal in the painting itself. They get the painting with the portal exit into the treasury itself. Looks like success, but then there's a complication. The painting in the vault tips over, face down, and the portal won't let them through into the treasury. This allows the heroes to then demonstrate more cleverness as well as resilience, as they're forced to think on their feet. And really, the whole thing is very D&D adventure party. The best laid plans will probably not survive the first roll of dice. The final time the portal magic is used is to distribute the villain's treasure to lure the citizens out of the trap that's been laid. And then it's not actually used in the final battle. But in this case, I don't mind that it's not used in the final confrontation. It's a utility spell, it doesn't outright do damage, and it's not immediately obvious how you would use this in combat. There certainly are ways to use it as tactics in direct combat. You have to look no further than when Brandon Sanderson takes over the Wheel of Time series, and oh boy do you see portals come into play. And given sufficient time, I would expect Simon to come up with new and interesting ways to make use of that portal-making spell to become really effective in combat. But it's not a plot contrivance or a plot hole if a character does not operate with absolute efficiency with every tool they have in their tool belt. There's a lot more obvious tools that they have on hand with dealing with the villain. And when you're moving fast, it's not obvious how you would use a portal in that final battle. And maybe another character would come up with something creative, but that's kind of the fun with different characters coming up with different ideas. But that all goes to show that the film is clever in its use of limited magic. Here are the range of options that our heroes have on hand. We introduce their powers relatively early, or introduce the powers in circumstances where the stakes are not that high, but then the heroes will keep using these powers in increasingly clever ways. So to conclude, don't be satisfied with lazy storytelling defending it with, well, it's magic, it's fiction, absolutely anything can happen. Absolutely, we want to encounter the fantastical. That's why we're reading and watching fantasy. We want to enter into new worlds with new rules. But those new rules creating limits on the world, that's a good thing. Coming up with crazy fantastical powers is also fun, but having limits to those crazy fantastical powers forces creativity and makes the story that much more interesting. And that's what I think Dungeons & Dragons did so well. It is certainly a wackier fantasy story than Lord of the Rings, but it understood the importance of limits on its magic system, and the story is stronger for it. Hey guys, I just want to add in. I have been overwhelmed with the amount of attention and comments and likes that these videos have been getting. The response was far greater than I would have dared to hope, and certainly far quicker than I ever would have guessed. I think what I'm mostly happy about is the discussions that are happening in the comments, with very few exceptions. Even where there's disagreement, people are being respectful to each other and being quite thoughtful. So keep on being excellent to each other. See you next time, and read some books.